please turn on the camera and share your slides.
So our next paper is going to continue on the theme of R&D funding. And I guess one way to help set it up is that, we've been hearing about push and pull, and there are many varieties of pull, and there are many, many varieties of push, including from many different government agencies, as well as philanthropies and others, and a lot of agencies that are represented here in this room. We see very different approaches of how you'd make decisions about grant funding in science and what that process can look like. And I think there's a lot of room for empirical work to sort of, really try to figure out what can be most effective. At the same time, there's room for a lot of theorizing here. And what this next presentation and paper is trying to do is actually step back from the innovation literature and look broadly at the contract theory literature, the organizational economics literature, which thinks a lot about how you allocate resources and decision rights across players in pursuit of some objective where people have their own interests. And so Christoph and his colleagues, we're delighted to have here to help us think a bit about what sort of kind of the frontier of economic theory can tell us about the kind of questions we should be asking and kind of open our minds a bit, I think, about the nature and potential designs around R&D funding. So please take it away, Christoph.
Thank you, Ben. And first of all, thank you for including our work into the program here. And as you highlighted, our overview will be mostly theoretical. So our hope here is that we can complement this fairly recent but nice overview by Pierre and Danielle Lee just a few years ago on the same topic in the same forum, but there the approach was more empirical. Okay. So let me clarify, this is joint work with Marco Ottaviani and Justus Preusser, who are both colleagues of mine at Bocconi. And given the audience, I don't have to make a strong point about science funding being important, but just to remind you that the understanding is that traditional market systems do not lead to an inefficient investment level in research. So generally, there's a widespread agreement that governments should invest into research. And governments invest to a big deal in their research funding agencies. But while there is this agreement on that we should invest into research, it's much less obvious on how we should invest into research. And there are many coexisting tools, right? We heard about this before, and you see research prizes, you see patents being used, but also grants. And of course, as the title suggested and as Ben suggested, our focus will be on grants here. Now, just to give you a brief story of why we care about grant funding sometimes. So the idea is that grants can sometimes be a superior tools to patents or prizes. So for example, patents incentivize research through market values, right? But often the market value might differ from the social value. So in these cases, if I want an innovation where the social value is different from the market value, I might want to use a grant to push people into that different research direction. Then when it comes to a comparison to prices, well, often basic research is very uncertain in terms of what we will find, what the outcomes will be. So not for any potential research questions, we can specify very well what a requirement would be to provide a solution to a certain question. Okay, so therefore we want to have maybe this more open-ended search, and this we cannot achieve with prices necessarily. Third dimension is that the timing of payments is fairly different when we compare grants to patents and prices. So often researchers might be financially constrained, so they need some resources up front to be able to carry out their research. Okay, and clearly patents and prices don't do that. So in this case, we might want to resort to grants to enable researchers to carry out a certain kind of research. And now the final point is that something that patents do is they restrict to some extent the usage of the findings. And maybe if a finding generates big positive externalities by inspiring follow-up research, these limitations might be undesirable. Okay, maybe it's a pill we have to swallow, but if we don't have to introduce these limitations in the use of a finding, then that would be potentially desirable. Okay. So, but with that motivation of grants being out there, let me tell you a little bit of how we are going to tackle the question of grant funding in this chapter. Okay, so a little illustration. I hope you can read it. So the traditional model would see, or a model without grants, would see a researcher who carries out some research that is based, where the decisions are based on the cost of carrying out the research, but also the potential benefits. And the potential benefits of the research, which are in the bottom box here, can derive from many sources, right? We don't want to take a stance on this. It can just be that researchers like to work on a certain question, have an intrinsic motivation to solve a particular problem. Maybe they care about recognition from the scientific community, or even they are motivated by patents and prices there. But the decision-making would be based on the researcher's cost of carrying out the work and the potential benefits, and weighing these two components, they decide on what they're going to do. Now, how does grant funding enter to that in our perspective? Well, we see grant funding as a step that comes before the researcher acts. Okay, so you receive a grant. Once you have the grant, you factor it in that you hold this grant when making these choices. Okay, but now in the next step, we want to break up grant funding into its individual steps. So what happens before you receive a grant as a researcher is you have to decide whether you want to apply for the grant. And applying is costly. So therefore, you're not always want to apply for a grant. You want to apply for a grant if you think it's sufficiently likely that you're going to win it, so you're willing to incur the cost. And then the funder collects all the applications, looks at the applications, and in some way makes a decision of who will receive the funding. Okay, but that's still not close enough to the models we look at, because before deciding who receives the funding, there is some prospective evaluation. Okay, so you look at these applications that you receive. You maybe have a review panel that is going to tell you, the funder now, with potentially some noise, who are the fund-worthy applicants. Okay, and only if I see a positive enough signal, I will give you the funds. Okay, so that's the first stage that we're going to look at. How should this application stage be designed, or what can we learn about this application stage from the literature in economic theory? But then there's also a second dimension, which comes after the grant has been awarded. And this is what we refer to for now as grant management, because once the money has been awarded, the researcher is more or less free in how to use these resources. Of course, there are constraints, but you have some leeway in how you invest these resources. Okay, and so therefore the funder may have an interest in monitoring the researcher to some extent, and use potential tools to align the interest of the researcher with that of the funder, which might not always be the same ones. And so in the first part of the talk, I will focus on the first step and show you one model which can guide our thinking a little bit. And in the second part, I will very briefly touch upon the second dimension, the grant management dimension of our overview here. Before getting into the details, let me just emphasize that the approach, as Ben mentioned, that we have is one of sort of modern economic theory. And in particular, we think of this application stage as ones in which the researchers have more precise information about the fund worthiness or about their merit than the funder, and the funder still has to make a decision who receives funds. So this is what we would call in the literature hidden information models, whereas in the grant management stage, the researchers take actions that are not directly observable to the funder, or even if they are observable, they are potentially non-contractable. Okay, so this is what we would call hidden action models. And once we've categorized these models in this way, we will use sort of insights from information economics and mechanism design that we can maybe export to grant funder. Okay, so that being said, a lot of the things that we talk about in the overview chapter are models which have not been tailored to grant funding, but instead we give an interpretation of these insights towards grant funding. Now let's start with the first step, where we think about this application and acceptance stage in the grant evaluation proposal. So what I'm going to tell you is based on a paper that has been tailored exactly to the funding context, which is a recent paper by Jérôme Mada and Marc Ottaviani. Okay, and the basic idea is fairly simple. So they're researchers and they have heterogeneous merit. So basically from the funder's perspective, some researchers I'm more inclined to fund and others not. So what the funder wants is you want to give money to those that you think are the most fund-worthy applicants, but the funder does not observe their fund-worthiness directly, but only a noisy signal about their fund-worthiness. So this is where the review panel comes in, which might have some noise in how they interpret the applications. Okay? The second dimension is, of course, that the funder has limited budget. You can't just give money to everyone. So how are you going to make these funding decisions? So in the first stage, the researcher knows their own fund worthiness and then decides whether it's worthwhile to apply for the grant. Then the funder observes all the applications together with an evaluation of their review panel and makes a decision on who should be the candidate that receives the grant. Now, in the first step, this model is very simple. Okay. So what is the funder going to do? Well, the funder is going to award the grants to those applicants with the most positive evaluation. Why is that the case? Well, this evaluation, while being noisy, it's still informative. So if I see a better evaluation, I think that's a better candidate. So he should or she should receive funds. Okay. So what the funder is then going to do is you rank candidates by their evaluation, keep awarding the grants until you run out of your budget. Now, what do the researchers do? They anticipate this behavior by the funder, and therefore a researcher that observes a high own fund worthiness or high own merit is going to think that she is more likely to win the grant than someone with a lower fund worthiness. Okay, so higher merit researchers have a higher success probability when applying. So that will imply that only researchers with sufficiently high merit are going to find it worthwhile to apply. Okay, so it's a very simple story. The best candidates will apply. Then the funder will award the grant to those with the best evaluations out of those who applied. But here comes a question that we think is interesting. Okay, so how does this interplay between the acceptance decision and the funding decision depend on this evaluation noise? Okay, and I'm trying to illustrate this to you in a graph. Here on the vertical axis, what I'm depicting is the probability of winning the grant as a researcher who has merit that's depicted on the horizontal axis. Okay, and so this is for a particular specification. So what we see is that only researchers which have a merit that's above a threshold are going to apply, and the probability of winning the grant is increasing in the merit. This is what I said. Evaluation is informative, so higher merit candidates are more likely to win. Okay, and so what's the threshold at which you start applying? Well, once the expected value of applying is higher than the cost of applying. So that gives you this cutoff there. Now, what this blue area represents is the expected number of grants that you will have to award. So that's sort of a measure of the budget that you need. Okay, so the funder has to design their acceptance rule such that you don't award more grants than you have money for. Okay? So now, what is going to happen if I change the noise in the evaluation? So in particular, what is going to happen if the application becomes less precise? Okay? Now, that just means, very simply, that the evaluation becomes less meritocratic. Having a higher fund worthiness is not going to increase your success probability as much as it did before, right? Because you're not going to be identified that likely as before that you are actually the good candidate. Okay, and the graph that's going to represent as this probability of being funded being flatter. But now if you remember that sort of the area under this curve describes the expected amount of grants. So what has happened now is that each person who applied before is now less likely to win the grant, which means that you do not exhaust your budget anymore. Okay? So how are you going to respond to this as a funder if the evaluation has become more noisy? Well, you're going to respond to this, that's the loss in the expected grants. So you're going to respond to this by encouraging more applications. So now you can exhaust your budget again, because by encouraging more applications, you get these new people in that are going to win a grant that didn't win before. Okay, so the basic consequence of now this more noisy evaluation is that there will be more applications than there were before, but the average applicant will have lower merit, okay, because it becomes more of a lottery now, whether you win or not. Okay. So why do we think that's an interesting question to talk about? Well, in many funding institutions, grants are awarded according to some measure of application numbers. Okay, so if you have many fields, somehow as a funder, you have to decide which field receives how much funding. Okay, clearly in an ideal world, we would allocate this funding according to which are the most fundworthiness fields, or where is the return of the dollar highest, or whatever. But that's a difficult question. So maybe assigning the money according to application numbers is a good idea. Seems fair, at least. So the NIH does that, the ERC does that. Many funding institutions use these proportional allocation rules. But now what happens if in a stylized model you have two fields that are symmetric in the sense of what's the merit of the applications there, but maybe one field is very hard to evaluate, so it has very noisy evaluation, and another field has more precise evaluation. Well, what's going to happen then, as we saw before, in the more noisy field, we will receive more applications than in the more precise field. But according to the proportional allocation rule, this means that the budget of the noisy field will go up, the budget of the precise field goes down. Okay? And that although these two fields are symmetric, except for the evaluation noise. But what a consequence of this is, well, you have less budget now, so then you must accept fewer candidates. So because you have to accept fewer candidates to apply, that will depress applications even more, right? Because compared to the situation where you had more funding before, you're less likely to win now, so you have even fewer applications, but that will continue to feed back into the budget assignment rule. Now you have even fewer applications, which means you will receive even less money in turn. Okay, and so this effect can be so strong in a theoretical extreme that fields with perfect information will not see any applications anymore, and therefore will not have any budget to fund any. Okay, so this is not to say that this proportional allocation is a terrible thing, but this is to say that if you use this, you have to be careful in how you design your proportional allocation rules. Okay. And to tell you that this, or to illustrate to you that this is not just a theoretical story, there is some empirical evidence also in the paper. So what happens in 2014 is that the ERC changed this proportional budget allocation. So before, this allocation was based on applications within a subfield, whereas from 2014 on, the allocation was based on application numbers across all the panels in the ERC. Okay, so it became more proportional overall. And you see that for the social sciences, that led to a big increase in the share of the budget that field received. Whereas for the life sciences, the budget share went down. Okay, and the authors in the paper used data from the ERC, which sort of measures reviewer agreement on applications. And this is in line with this particular story, that it seems that the social sciences are more noisy to evaluate. So in line with that, you see the budget share going up, where the life sciences seem to be less noisy in their evaluations. So again, this is in line with the story of the paper that they should see a decrease in the budget. Good. Now, that's just one perspective on this application process. In the chapter, we discuss several other components of the application process that are interesting, we believe at least. So to give you an idea of what we talk about, well, you can think about researchers before applying to invest in the quality of their proposals, right? And then the question is, how does the acceptance decision, the design of the acceptance decision, affect the investments into the quality of the proposal? But on the other hand, you can also have sort of persuasion efforts of the agents, which is basically just socially wasteful investments in making your proposal look better, which do not improve your proposal per se. And the question is, how do you want to deal with that? So the question is, how do we have to design these acceptance rule when we take these factors into account? Okay. And last thing that we address is, what if this evaluation is actually costly, right? So if I have many applications, I cannot do a deep dive maybe on every on every application. So how do I balance this decision of I want to learn a lot about applicants, but I also don't want to overspend on evaluation costs. Okay, so if you want to know more about that, you might have to look into the chapter or ask me afterwards. Unfortunately, I can't go over it right now, because I briefly want to talk about the retrospective evaluation dimension. So here we are in the lower segment, right, where a researcher has been awarded a grant before and now exerts effort on the research. Now, why is that potentially a problem? Well, as I alluded to in the beginning, it might be the case that there is this potential conflict of interest between the funder and the researcher. The researcher has discretion over how to use the funds, but the funder might want the researcher to work on a specific topic. Okay? So there's this privately optimal action for the researcher and the socially optimal action for the funder. And this is going to arise, well, of course, if the researcher prefers a different action than the funder. And the question that results from this is, are there tools that a grant funder who has already given money to the researcher can use to align these incentives again? Okay. And the story is, if you look at the moral hazard literature, at the contract theory literature, the solution is fairly easy. Well, if as a funder you observe some measure of what the researcher did, then you can use this observation to either reward the researcher or to punish the researcher for the actions that they took. But in contrast to the standard contract theory perspective, when we think about grants, we don't think about giving bonus payments to the researchers directly. So we don't really use monetary rewards as flexibly as, say, for CEO compensation. Okay? And so the ideas that we discuss in the chapter are once a dynamic story, which derives from the Maurer and Scotchmer paper, where basically you have an observation of what the researcher did in the past. And if the researcher did something that you didn't like, then you exclude that researcher from future grant calls. Okay? So why is that useful? Well, if the researcher anticipates that by taking a certain action, I'm not eligible for future funding anymore, you have a punishment sort of for this misbehavior. Okay? And that might make the action that without this punishment seemed attractive, seem unattractive suddenly. Okay? Another way of trying to achieve a similar goal is by just splitting the grant into several stages. Okay, so you don't give all the funding away to the researcher in one go, but you do some intermediate evaluation of the researcher's performance. Okay, and then only if what the researcher did was in line with what you expected, you release the next tranche of funding. Okay, so what this tells us is that as a funder, and I know many funding institutions do use tools like that, using these cleverly can sort of align the funder's incentives with the researcher's incentive. Okay, and in the chapter we talk about sort of more complicated settings of this hidden action problem and discuss how you can use these tools even if there's some learning over time, if what you observe is imperfect, and several of these dimensions of what you can still learn from the contract theory literature, even if you don't have these flexible monetary rewards. Good. So now I want to, sort of tell you a little bit about sort of the general takeaways that we find while summarizing these papers. So first of all, and I know that's an ongoing discussion, we find a lot of also theoretical reasons why using randomization and grant allocation or lotteries are good for providing incentives to researchers or also allowing to economize on the evaluation costs. But there's a note of caution there. There are settings, in particular, when you care about sort of ex ante investment into quality of the agents, you may want to be careful with using these lotteries. Okay, and then in a second part is we find a lot of theoretical reasons to use the staging of the grants and this potentially temporary exclusion from future calls, because that gives you a tool to reward and punish agents, which is not only valuable in the grant management stage, but also if you look in the application stage. So basically you could detect someone misreported something in their application, and then afterwards you want to punish them. Good. Now, last minute, I want to spend on this overview that I showed you in the very beginning, and highlight some of the things that would be nice to know, but we don't know yet. So what we see in this overview in the theory literature is quite a lot of insights into sort of separate aspects in this graph, right? We learned something about the interaction of the application decision with the funding decision. We learned something about the grant management stage, but it would be nice to have this full picture. And I think that ties nicely in with the previous talk. There is, we completely ignored for now where these rewards for the research are coming from, right? We only looked at this, sort of the push incentives, the grant funding, but sort of generating a better understanding of how you can combine these two tools together to maybe get better applications, get better actions by the researchers. You can also think about sort of improving the direction that research takes, right? By sort of maybe creating a hot area through funding decisions where market value does not provide the right incentives. Okay, so getting a more integrated understanding of how to optimally use these tools would sort of be desirable. And I think there's kind of good scope of having more empirical research in terms of which features of the models seem to be the relevant ones. And I guess also sort of insights from the more policy dimension of what are the things that the funders care about. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Corey, one quick question. I mean, so you, just to push you a bit on randomization, I mean, partly because we heard the theme of no one knows anything before. And then when you hear that, you think, well, why don't we just randomize evaluation? That would save all the reviewer costs. But I think what you pointed out is that that affects applications too, and maybe not in a healthy way. I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about sort of the hidden costs there from a sort of application side, but also, is there a subtler version of randomization, right? Do you sort of screen out really low quality, but then randomize everything else, or to sort of guard against some of the challenges that might ensue?
Right. So that's a very good point. So if you think back at the first model that I showed you, when you do full randomization, then the probability of winning the grant does not depend on your merit anymore at all, which means that either everyone applies or no one is going to apply. Of course, that means that you lose all the benefits of the self-selection of researchers, right? Because when evaluation is informative, you do already achieve, alone through the application costs that are there, the self-selection of researchers that only the best researchers apply. Okay, and so there's where this trade-off comes in. When you move closer to randomization, then you move to less self-selection of the researchers in the first stage. So you receive a lot of applications, but your decision is very little merit-based, which is bad in particular, or potentially bad if you have a small budget, because you're very likely to get the researchers that you don't want. When it comes to more subtler forms of randomization, so something that drops out of many of these models is that once you see evaluations, you categorize them in sort of two groups. One group that is maybe the high or the very attractive applications and less attractive applications. And then you might want to do randomization only on the lower group. Okay, whereas you assign after verifying the potential of the applications on the top group. Okay, so you use that in some sort of in a tier structure. You categorize applicants in the top tier, lower tier, and then you use different randomization strategies there.